The day they put a sign on my family's land, they thought they were announcing the future. They had no idea they were standing on a piece of history they could never own. I still remember the sound before I saw the sign. The low rumble of construction trucks moving across the gravel road, the sharp beeping of equipment backing up near the old pasture, and the steady hum of engines cutting through what had always been the quietest place I knew. The morning air smelled like fresh dirt, wild grass, and the cedar trees that lined the northern edge of our farm. For 46 years, that smell had meant home. That morning, it meant someone had arrived without asking. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and my family has lived on this land for generations. Our farm sits across nearly 300 acres of rolling fields, old barns, and open pasture in a valley where most people still wave when they pass each other on the road. My grandfather used to tell me that land remembers the people who care for it. At the time, I thought it was just something old farmers said. I did not understand how true those words were until the day I came home and found orange survey flags planted along my fence line. A large white sign stood near the entrance to my property. It carried the HOA logo and a message announcing a future community expansion project. Luxury homes, private roads, new amenities. Everything they wanted to build was described in polished words, but there was one problem. They were planning to build it on land that belonged to my family. I parked my old pickup beside the red barn and walked toward the entrance gate. The morning sun reflected off the windows of a row of vehicles parked near the field. A group of contractors reviewed blueprints, while workers measured sections of pasture that my father had spent his entire life maintaining. Then I saw her. Caroline Whitaker, the president of the HOA, stood near the plans wearing a perfectly pressed blazer and holding a folder of documents. She looked at the property like someone admiring a finished project, not like someone standing on land that had never belonged to her. She recognized me and smiled politely. She was not angry. She was not worried. She was confident. She told me the development had already received approvals, that the community had been planning this expansion for months, and that everything was being handled according to regulations. I asked her one simple question. I asked her when my family had ever transferred ownership of the farm. For the first time, her expression changed slightly. It lasted only a second, but I noticed. She explained that older property boundaries were often complicated and that the HOA had relied on modern records. Then she handed me a packet of paperwork and told me their attorneys had reviewed everything. I looked down at those papers while the wind moved through the tall grass behind me. My grandfather's old windmill turned slowly in the distance, exactly where it had stood for decades. I had no idea then that the answer to everything was hidden inside my own family's history. Caroline believed she was dealing with a farmer who would eventually give in. What she did not know was that my family's connection to this valley started long before there was an HOA, long before there were paved roads, and long before anyone thought they could simply redraw the story of the land. The morning after I found those survey flags along my fence line, I woke up before sunrise like I had every day for most of my life. The difference was that this time, the sound of the windmill turning above the pasture did not feel peaceful. It felt like a reminder that something I had always protected was suddenly being questioned by people who had never walked these fields before. I stepped outside my farmhouse with a cup of black coffee in my hand and looked across the valley. The mist was still resting above the grass. The cattle moved slowly near the southern fence, and the old red barn stood exactly where my grandfather built it nearly 70 years earlier. To anyone else, it probably looked like an ordinary farm. To me, every corner held a memory. The fence posts my father replaced during harsh winters. The oak tree where my grandfather taught me how to read weather patterns. The small storage building where generations of Caldwell family records had been kept. This land was never just property. It was a family story written across 300 acres. Later that morning, I drove into town to visit the county records office. I was not looking for a fight. I was looking for facts. That was how my father always handled problems. He used to say that emotions can make noise, but records tell the truth. The county building smelled like old paper, polished wood, and fresh coffee. Behind the front counter, a clerk named Margaret listened carefully as I explained the situation. When I mentioned the farm name, her expression changed slightly. She asked me to wait while she checked the archived property files. A few minutes later, she returned with a thick folder that looked like it had not been opened in years. Inside were modern surveys, tax records, and property maps. Most of them seemed ordinary at first. Then I noticed something strange. Several documents referenced older records that were not included in the file. Margaret explained that some historical documents had been moved to a separate archive because they were considered part of the county heritage collection. She mentioned that older land records from the valley were often preserved because many early families helped establish the original settlement. That sentence stayed with me. Original settlement. I had heard those words before, but I never connected them to my own family. When I returned home that afternoon, I walked through the old barn and looked at things I had passed hundreds of times without thinking. A faded wooden sign with the Caldwell name carved into it. An old leather journal on a shelf. A metal box that belonged to my grandfather. I opened the journal first. The pages were filled with handwritten notes about weather, crops, livestock, and repairs. Then, near the back, I found something that made me stop. There was a name written in careful black ink. Samuel Caldwell. Beneath it were words I had never seen before. Founder of the Valley Settlement. I sat there in the quiet barn with dust floating through the afternoon sunlight, realizing that the story of my family might have started much earlier than I ever knew. The HOA thought they were dealing with a simple property dispute. They had no idea they had just forced me to uncover a history that had been waiting for generations to be remembered. Over the next several days, I stopped paying attention to the construction equipment and started paying attention to history instead. Every evening after finishing my work around the farm, I carried another box of old family papers from the barn into the farmhouse. The dining room table slowly disappeared beneath rolled maps, yellowed letters, faded photographs, and leather-bound journals that smelled faintly of dust and cedar. I realized my grandfather had saved nearly everything, even items that seemed ordinary at first glance. Receipts for fencing materials, handwritten notes about neighboring families, and sketches of the valley all rested beside official documents that reached back more than a century. I kept thinking about the name I had found inside the journal. Samuel Caldwell, founder of the Valley Settlement. The more I read, the less it sounded like family folklore, and the more it resembled documented history. Early the next morning, I returned to the County Heritage Archive, a quiet brick building attached to the local historical museum. The archivist greeted me warmly and carefully listened as I explained what I had discovered. When I mentioned Samuel Caldwell, she smiled with genuine surprise and led me into a climate-controlled records room lined with shelves filled with carefully preserved boxes. She placed several oversized books on a large wooden table and opened them one by one. Inside were newspaper clippings, original settlement maps, and photographs showing the earliest days of the valley. One picture immediately caught my attention. A group of settlers stood beside a newly built wooden meeting hall, and beneath the photograph was a handwritten caption identifying Samuel Caldwell as one of the founding organizers who donated farmland for roads, schools, and the first church, while specifically reserving the family farm as protected agricultural land. I felt my heartbeat slow as every new page connected another piece of a puzzle I had never known existed. Meanwhile, the development outside my property continued moving forward. Fresh concrete driveways appeared where open pasture had once stretched across the hills. Decorative streetlights rose beside newly paved roads, and colorful sales banners welcomed prospective homeowners every weekend. Caroline Whitaker appeared regularly in local newspaper articles celebrating the growth of the community, speaking confidently about progress, opportunity, and careful planning. Looking at those photographs beside the archive records, I realized neither she nor anyone else seemed aware that the very community she proudly represented had been built upon land first organized by my own family generations earlier. Before leaving the archive, the archivist handed me a reference card listing several additional documents stored in the state historical collection. She quietly said that family founders often left legal agreements that never appeared in ordinary county files because they had been preserved separately as historical records. As I drove home beneath the wide afternoon sky, the wind carried the scent of fresh hay through my open truck window. The old windmill slowly turned above the pasture just as it always had, but now I looked at it differently. It was no longer simply part of the landscape. It had become a silent witness to a story that had survived for generations, waiting for someone carrying the Caldwell name to finally uncover the truth. By the end of that week, I understood something that completely changed the way I looked at the dispute. This was no longer about survey flags or construction permits. It was about a piece of history that had quietly survived while everyone else assumed it had disappeared. The State Historical Archive sat nearly 90 miles away, and I left before dawn with a truck full of notes, copies of old journals, and more questions than answers. Rain clouds drifted across the highway while the smell of wet earth filled the cab every time I cracked the window. I kept replaying my grandfather's words in my mind. He always said that if a family wanted to protect its future, it first had to remember its past. I never imagined those words would become legal advice. The archive occupied a restored courthouse built more than a century ago. Inside, polished oak floors creaked beneath every step, and rows of climate-controlled cabinets stretched farther than I expected. An archivist named Helen listened patiently as I explained why I was searching for Samuel Caldwell. She disappeared into a restricted storage room and returned carrying several oversized document boxes tied with faded cotton ribbons. Every movement she made was careful, almost ceremonial, as if she already understood the importance of what rested inside. We opened the first box together. It contained handwritten correspondence between early settlers, original land sketches, and meeting records from the Valley's founding committee. Then Helen carefully unfolded a large parchment map drawn by hand more than 100 years earlier. The edges were worn, but the ink remained remarkably clear. My family's farm occupied the center of the valley exactly where it still stood today. Around it were handwritten notes describing donated land for schools, churches, public roads, and future community growth. One sentence immediately caught my attention. Samuel Caldwell had transferred specific parcels for public benefit while permanently reserving the original farm and its surrounding agricultural acreage for his direct heirs. Helen quietly looked at me and said that language like this was uncommon because founders rarely anticipated large-scale residential development generations later. She recommended that I obtain certified copies immediately before leaving the archive. As I signed the request forms, my phone buzzed repeatedly with notifications from neighbors. More construction equipment had arrived at my farm that morning. New entrance signs were being installed, and model homes were opening for weekend tours. Caroline Whitaker appeared in another local newspaper photograph, smiling beside developers as she announced that the expansion represented the future of the valley. Looking at that article while holding certified copies of documents written before the first paved road even existed, I realized something she still did not. Every modern approval she celebrated depended upon assumptions made long after my ancestor established the land itself. That evening I returned home as the setting sun painted the fields with deep amber light. The old windmill turned slowly against the horizon while cattle grazed peacefully beneath it, completely unaware of the legal storm unfolding around them. I carried the archive documents into the farmhouse and spread them across the same dining table that had slowly disappeared beneath family history. For the first time since this dispute began, I no longer felt like I was searching for answers. I felt like the answers had finally started searching for me. The following Monday morning, I met with an experienced property attorney whose office overlooked the county courthouse square. Shelves filled with thick legal books lined every wall, and framed survey maps from decades of land disputes hung beside certificates that reflected a lifetime of work. After listening quietly to everything that had happened, he spread my documents across a large conference table and examined each page without rushing. He compared the county records, the historical archive copies, my grandfather's journals, and the original settlement map until the room became almost completely silent except for the turning of paper. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and looked directly at me. He said that the modern documents appeared organized, but they all relied upon one assumption that nobody had bothered to verify. They assumed every historic transfer had already taken place exactly as later surveys described. If even one essential transfer had never legally occurred, every later document built upon that assumption could become questionable. Those words stayed with me during the drive home. Outside my truck window, fields of late summer grass rolled beneath a bright blue sky, while the familiar outline of the old windmill slowly appeared on the horizon. For the first time since the dispute began, I felt that I was no longer reacting to events. I was finally beginning to understand them. Over the next several days, my attorney requested certified copies from multiple government offices while an independent title specialist reconstructed the complete chain of ownership reaching back to the earliest settlement. At the same time, a licensed surveyor visited my farm carrying modern equipment along with copies of historical field notes that had not been referenced in decades. We walked together across the pasture from one weathered stone marker to another, measuring distances that my ancestors had first recorded by hand generations earlier. Every measurement matched the original settlement documents more closely than the recent development surveys. The surveyor paused beside the old windmill and smiled quietly before explaining that permanent landmarks often outlast changing paperwork. That sentence reminded me of something my grandfather once told me while we repaired that same windmill together. He said the strongest landmarks were not built to impress people. They were built so future generations would never lose their way. Meanwhile, construction continued beyond my fence line. More families toured the newly completed model homes, fresh landscaping covered areas that had once been open pasture, and advertisements promised buyers an ideal community surrounded by beautiful countryside. Caroline Whitaker continued speaking confidently at public meetings, repeating that every approval had been properly secured and that the project represented responsible growth for the valley. I never interrupted her or challenged her in public. Instead, I quietly organized every certified document, every survey, every historical record, and every legal opinion into carefully labeled folders. One evening, after the sun disappeared behind the western hills, I stood outside the farmhouse listening to crickets echo across the fields while a cool breeze carried the scent of fresh hay through the air. The lights from the new neighborhood shimmered in the distance, but my attention remained fixed on the old windmill turning steadily against the evening sky. I realized the dispute had never been a contest between the past and the future. It was a question of whether the truth had been properly remembered. By the time my attorney called to tell me the court had accepted our filing, I knew the real battle would not be fought with loud arguments. It would be decided by records that had waited patiently for more than a century to speak for themselves. The hearing was still several weeks away, but the atmosphere around the farm had already begun to change. Every morning, I drove past freshly finished homes that now stood where open views of the valley had once stretched for miles. Families toured model houses while real estate signs promised peaceful country living, and every advertisement showed smiling faces beneath the same hills my family had worked for generations. None of those visitors knew they were standing in the middle of a dispute that reached back more than a century. They simply trusted that everything had already been settled. Caroline Whitaker certainly believed it had. She continued attending community meetings, presenting polished reports filled with construction milestones, occupancy projections, and future landscaping plans. Her confidence never seemed forced. She genuinely believed the paperwork supporting the development was complete. My attorney reminded me that confidence and legal certainty were not always the same thing. During the following days, we met repeatedly to organize every document in chronological order. Certified land patents rested beside handwritten settlement agreements. Historic survey maps were matched against modern aerial photographs. Copies of county filings, tax assessments, inheritance records, and family probate documents slowly formed a complete chain reaching from the earliest days of the valley to the present. As each page found its proper place, I realized the story was becoming clearer than it had ever been before. One afternoon, an independent title specialist arrived carrying a thick binder containing the reconstructed ownership history. We spent nearly 4 hours reviewing every transfer, every recorded deed, and every legal description. Occasionally he paused, adjusted his glasses, and compared one document against another before making careful notes in the margin. Finally, he closed the binder and looked at me with a calm expression. He explained that every modern transaction depended upon a historical assumption that had simply been repeated over time instead of independently verified. The original reservation protecting my family's agricultural property appeared consistently in the earliest records, yet later documents gradually stopped mentioning it without ever identifying a lawful instrument that removed it. Nothing dramatic had happened. The omission had simply been copied from one generation of paperwork to the next until everyone assumed it no longer existed. That discovery did not guarantee victory, but it changed the entire direction of our case. Back at the farm, I walked toward the old windmill as evening settled across the fields. The blades turned steadily in the cool breeze while long shadows stretched across the pasture. I placed my hand on one of the weathered wooden posts my father had repaired years earlier and quietly reflected on how easily history can fade when no one takes the time to read it. The development lights glowed beyond the fence line, bright reminders that modern progress had moved forward without ever looking back. Yet every important answer we needed had been waiting patiently inside forgotten records, preserved by people who believed future generations would someday need them. When my attorney called later that evening, he told me the court had scheduled our first formal hearing and that both sides would soon exchange their complete evidence. I thanked him, set the phone down, and looked once more across the valley. For the first time since the survey flags appeared on my land, I felt completely prepared. I was no longer relying on hope or family stories. I was relying on documented history that had survived every passing generation, quietly waiting for its rightful place to be recognized. The morning of the first hearing arrived with clear skies and cool autumn air settling across the valley. I left the farm before sunrise, pausing only long enough to look back at the old windmill turning slowly above the pasture. The familiar sound steadied my thoughts as I drove toward the courthouse, carrying 2 leather cases filled with certified records, historical maps, title reports, and family documents that had survived for generations. My attorney met me outside the courthouse steps, greeted me with a quiet nod, and reminded me that we did not need dramatic speeches. We only needed the truth presented in the correct order. Inside the courtroom, polished wooden benches gradually filled with local residents, reporters, surveyors, attorneys, and several people who had already purchased homes in the new development. They all expected to witness an ordinary property dispute. None of them realized the case would reach much farther into the valley's history than anyone had imagined. Caroline Whitaker entered carrying herself with the same calm confidence I had seen since the day she first stood on my land. Her legal team arranged neatly organized binders across their table, while large presentation boards displayed subdivision plats, zoning approvals, engineering reports, and county permits. Everything appeared complete, professional, and convincing. Looking across the room, I understood why so many people believed the matter had already been settled. Modern paperwork has a way of making assumptions look permanent. When the hearing began, Caroline's attorney carefully explained how the development had followed every current regulation. He described planning meetings, environmental reviews, engineering studies, and recorded surveys. Large maps were placed before the court showing streets, drainage systems, utility corridors, and residential lots extending across land my family had cared for since long before those maps existed. The presentation lasted nearly an hour and was delivered with confidence from beginning to end. My attorney listened without interruption, occasionally making a brief note beside one of the historical records resting in front of us. When our turn arrived, there were no dramatic objections and no raised voices. Instead, my attorney walked slowly to the presentation table carrying only a small collection of certified documents. He began with the earliest land patent, followed by the settlement records preserved in the state archive, then the original survey prepared during the founding of the valley. Each document connected naturally to the next until the entire history formed one continuous chain reaching from Samuel Caldwell to my grandfather, my father, and finally to me. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter as enlarged copies of the handwritten settlement map appeared beside the modern subdivision plans. The old windmill, the stone boundary markers, and the original agricultural reservation all occupied the same locations they still held today. Even the independent surveyor testified that the historical landmarks matched the earliest field notes with remarkable accuracy. Caroline remained composed, but I noticed her reviewing documents with greater concentration than before. She quietly spoke with her attorney several times while comparing the historical records against the modern title reports. For the first time since this dispute began, uncertainty replaced confidence on the opposite side of the courtroom. As the hearing paused for a short recess, I looked through the courthouse window toward the distant hills surrounding the valley. I thought about every generation of my family that had protected this place without ever expecting their careful records would one day become the strongest voice in a courtroom. The truth had not arrived all at once. It had been assembled piece by piece, patiently preserved until every forgotten page finally fit together exactly where it belonged. When the hearing resumed that afternoon, the courtroom felt noticeably different. The quiet conversations that had filled the room during the recess disappeared as everyone returned to their seats. Even the reporters who had been casually reviewing their notes now watched the bench with careful attention. The judge thanked both sides for their presentations and began reviewing several exhibits one by one. My attorney remained calm, saying very little unless the court requested clarification. Caroline Whitaker sat upright beside her legal team, occasionally turning pages inside a thick binder filled with permits, planning approvals, engineering reports, and subdivision records. Nothing about her expression suggested panic. She still believed those documents represented the complete history of the property. Then the judge slowly lifted one of the enlarged historical maps we had introduced earlier that morning. He compared it with the modern subdivision plat displayed beside it before looking toward Caroline's attorney. His next question was delivered in a steady, conversational tone that filled the silent courtroom without requiring a raised voice. He asked whether the development team could identify the recorded legal instrument that removed the original agricultural reservation established by Samuel Caldwell for his direct heirs before the land entered the chain of title supporting the subdivision. For several seconds, nobody answered. Caroline looked toward her attorney, who immediately began searching through multiple binders while another member of the legal team quietly reviewed digital records on a laptop. The judge waited patiently. There was no pressure in his voice, only a request for documentation. Additional files were opened, page after page carefully examined, yet the courtroom remained almost completely silent except for the sound of paper turning. My attorney did not interrupt. He simply placed one certified historical record beside another in chronological order, allowing the absence of a recorded transfer to become increasingly clear without unnecessary argument. The independent title specialist was then asked to explain the chain of title reconstruction completed before the hearing. Using certified county records, probate filings, archived settlement documents, and subsequent conveyances, he carefully demonstrated that every recorded ownership transfer had been accounted for except the one document necessary to remove the founder's original reservation. According to the historical record, that reservation had never been lawfully extinguished. Instead, later surveys gradually stopped mentioning it while assuming it had already disappeared. The courtroom remained remarkably quiet, as everyone understood the significance of that explanation. Caroline lowered her eyes toward the documents spread across the table in front of her. For the first time since I had met her, she appeared less certain than confident. She quietly asked her attorney another question, but he answered with only a slight shake of his head before returning to the files. The judge thanked the witnesses, accepted several additional certified exhibits into evidence, and announced that he would take the matter under advisement after reviewing the complete historical record submitted by both parties. No dramatic declaration followed. No celebration erupted inside the courtroom. Instead, everyone stood as the hearing concluded, fully aware that a carefully preserved piece of history had changed the entire direction of a dispute once believed to be straightforward. As I stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, the courthouse clock quietly marked the passing hour. I looked toward the distant hills beyond the town and thought about my grandfather's journals resting safely inside my truck. Generations of careful record-keeping had not spoken through emotion or anger. They had spoken through patience, accuracy, and truth. And for the first time since this dispute began, I believe the valley was finally remembering its own history. 3 weeks passed before the written decision arrived. During that time, life on the farm continued much as it always had. Every morning, I fed the cattle, repaired fences where needed, and watched the old windmill turn above the pasture as cool autumn breezes crossed the valley. The construction site beyond my boundary remained unusually quiet. The model homes were still standing, the streets were still there, but the steady rhythm of expansion had slowed. Everyone seemed to be waiting for the same answer. On a clear Thursday afternoon, my attorney called and asked me to meet him at his office. When I arrived, the official court order rested neatly on his desk. He smiled before saying a single word because he already knew what that document meant not only for me, but for the history of the entire valley. The court concluded that the historical agricultural reservation established by Samuel Caldwell had never been lawfully extinguished through any recorded instrument. Because that foundational interest remained part of the chain of title, The modern assumptions supporting portions of the development could not override the original protected rights preserved for the founders' direct heirs. The decision did not erase the neighborhood that had already been built, nor did it create unnecessary hardship for families who had purchased homes in good faith. Instead, it required every future decision involving the affected property to recognize the lawful historical ownership that had existed all along. My attorney explained that negotiations would now proceed from the correct legal foundation instead of an incorrect assumption repeated over many years. As we left the office, I looked across the courthouse square where people continued their ordinary routines without realizing they had just witnessed an important piece of local history being restored. A few days later, I returned to the farm before sunrise. The air carried the familiar scent of fresh hay and damp earth while the first light spread slowly across the open fields. I walked toward the old windmill and rested my hand against the weathered wooden post my father had repaired years before. Nothing about the landscape seemed different, yet everything felt different because the truth had finally been acknowledged. Caroline Whitaker later issued a public statement recognizing the court's decision and confirming that the development plans would be revised to respect the historical property rights identified during the case. I never celebrated her disappointment because I had never wanted anyone to lose. I simply wanted my family's history to be remembered accurately. The certified records were carefully placed inside archival sleeves and returned to the farmhouse, where they rested beside my grandfather's journals and the faded settlement map that had quietly waited for generations to tell its story. Standing beside the pasture, I watched the late afternoon sunlight settle across the same land my ancestors had protected more than a century earlier. The old windmill continued turning exactly as it always had, never caring about changing governments, new neighborhoods, or modern assumptions. It simply marked the place where history and the present still met. My grandfather once told me that land remembers the people who protect it, even when the world forgets. I finally understood what he meant. Justice had not arrived through louder voices, greater influence, or sharper arguments. It arrived because patient people preserved the truth, one document at a time, until history was finally given the chance to speak for itself.